kia tau e te Māori tū, kia tau e te Māori ora, kia tātou katoa. Tūturu, whakamaua, kia tina, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te atua, nana ihanga e ngā mea katoa. Ko te mihi tuarua ki ngā mate, haere, haere, haere. Kia koutou te hunga ora, ngā manuhiri kia tai mai. Tina koutou, tina tātou katoa. Ko kake puka te maunga, ko waipa te awa, no te kuiti aho, ko te atatu aho I noho ana kei Sport Waitākere aho I mahi ana, ko Caitlin McCall toku ingoa. Nō reira, tina koutou, tina. Kia ora and welcome everyone. I am Caitlin McCall. I'm a Strategic Relationships Manager in the Healthy Families Waitākere team at Sport Waitākere here in Tamaki Makaurau. It is very rainy here today. I've also got my colleague Grace Voinovich online. She's also helping out today. So kia ora, Grace.
Kia ora, everyone.
Firstly, we really want to acknowledge those who are impacted by COVID-19. We understand this is a time of uncertainty, and we really want to acknowledge everyone who is working really hard right now to keep our community safe and well. And I also want to acknowledge you all, big mihi. Thank you for joining us today and taking the time to listen to this kōrero. I am really excited. I've got my team members on this webinar today. We have Fole Finau, who's our systems innovator. He'll be talking first. And we also have our manager, Kerry Allan, of our Healthy Families Waitākere team. I'll be introducing you to Fole soon. He'll be talking about how we've been working alongside the health and social services to identify collective actions to enhance Pasifika wellbeing. We'll leave the time at the end of his presentation for him to answer any of your questions. So please, while he's talking, write questions into the chat on Zoom, and Grace and I will put these to him at the end of the presentation. At 11:30, we will hear from Kerry Allan, and she'll be talking about how we have been working alongside community and key stakeholders to forge closer links between health and built environments. We will also have time at the end of Kerry's presentation to answer any of your questions. If you have any questions for Fole, please put them in as well, and he can also answer them at the end. Even though these two kaupapa are quite different, when I was thinking about them this morning, I thought they were about future-proofing. They're future-proofing for our next few generations. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind while you're listening to them today. It is now my pleasure to introduce you and hand you over to my friend, colleague, Fole. Kia ora, maloelele, Fole, if you want to unmute yourself and start.
Cool. Thank you, Caitlin. Let me just get this sorted. Cool. Thank you for that, Caitlin. Maloi lau maria ho eiki. Mo le lea kainga koto pe he ngalo pe. Ko kingoa ko Fole Finau me masila mea. Pako kari le lea ki mo tolu ke tau polkalama tala noe ponbongini. Greetings to you all from a wet and windy Waitākere, which we're very grateful for because we need the rain. My name is Fole Finau. I'm the Pasifika Systems Innovator here at Healthy Families Waitākere. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge tangata whenua, and more specifically mana whenua from where I am, Te Kawerau Āmaki, and also of the land that you may be joining us from. I also want to thank and acknowledge everyone here in your capacity as leaders, influencers, and change makers from your respective communities. I'm really humbled to be given this opportunity to tala noa about our work in Pasifika systems change. But before I delve more into our approach, I just want to cover off quickly what the system looks like for Pasifika. We already know this stuff here. You know, we're a growing population in West Auckland. We're young, but we do die earlier, much earlier than non-Māori and non-Pacific. And a lot of you know that there's a lot more stats that we're tagged to that are not very good. And that in itself is a problem. And considering that systems change is about advancing equity by shifting the conditions that hold a problem in place, what are the systems or conditions that are holding us in this sort of never-ending cycle of being at the bottom of the ladder? And I call this governing systems. Governing systems are not just central government, as you can see there, but the characteristics of this system is that it recognizes visible or large organizations over smaller expert groups. It recognizes structures like their own, so it perpetuates their own sorts of systems. It's the system that controls the resources, but it's also usually based largely on equality, sorry. And this system is more often than not more comfortable dealing with bureaucracies rather than communities. And in this illustration, the arrows represent resource flows. And governing systems are supposed to create fair and just policies and systems that enable Pasifika to lead and tackle the social determinants of health. But despite years of investment to develop explicit policy to improve Pasifika health, the reality is Pasifika communities continue to face inequitable burden of preventable chronic disease. So what then does this governing system look like from a Pasifika lens? And this is what it looks like from a Pasifika lens. And in this slide, Pasifika communities to me include the churches, our businesses, and our small to medium NGOs. Again, keeping in mind the arrows are resource flows. And so for a long time now, Pasifika community has given insights, research, feedback, consultation to what we see as a fractured governing system that more often than not misrepresents what we need and want. And this speaks to the research fatigue currently experienced, or that has been experienced by our community. However, what the community then sees in terms of return are insufficient resources, which is that small black arrow in the middle there going back to the Pasifika community. Insufficient resources for initiatives that are closely tied to the outcomes required by the governing systems. You know, the governing systems in place to support the Pasifika communities also operate in a way which sets or pits organizations against each other. So for funding, for resources, and this leads to limited sharing of information and data, duplication of services, and inconsistent messaging for our Pasifika communities. So what we're working towards in terms of systems change is this, where there is an equitable allocation of resources. So from our Pasifika community perspective, we're giving or we're informing the governing systems. We don't see a whole lot of resources flowing around in and amongst itself. But what we see is that the Pasifika community working together to inform our governing systems of what we need and how we need to achieve our aspirations. And then the governing systems provide sufficient resources for us to do what we need to do, so that we're essentially steering and leading the canoe at the same time. So that's the ideal. That's where we're trying to work towards. And how we've gone about it has been based upon Pasifika values. And some of the values are there. But the key thing is that we're trying to build social capital. So really strong relationships leads to strong communities. And this is, I guess, the opposite to building the economical capital, you know, which is about personal wealth and individual well-being. So keeping that in mind, our approach is about building social capital in our Pasifika communities. And so what does that look like in action? So using the systems change framework that some of you might have seen before, I can illustrate what I mean by this. And based on the Pasifika values, not surprisingly, our focus is in that relational change or semi-explicit level. So we've worked really hard to build quality relationships and connections between people and organizations. And that is the basis, or that's what's allowed us to be effective at the other levels. And I'll give some examples at this stage. So at an explicit level, in the policy space or the rules space, because of strong relationships that we have built, we've been invited to join influential Pasifika and mainstream networks. And some of these mainstream networks are very closely connected to the DHB leadership and funding arms. And so our work in this space was to lead the change of their terms of reference or their rules so that they're more community facing. So this will enable our community voice to be sitting at that decision-making table, all our community insights to be informing those that make decisions at that, in this policy space. Something a little bit more practical in the practice space. We built a really strong relationship with Aotearoa's largest Pacific NGO, which is the Fole, based in West Auckland. And through them, we collaborated with their Inuaola program and 20 Pasifika churches and community groups to design and translate a water pledge into 7 languages. Now, this water pledge was a commitment to choose water as first choice in their spaces. Now, the churches and community groups not only signed the water pledge, but were part of its development, establishing a real sense of ownership. And this, I guess, is covered is about us supporting Pasifika organizations to proactively use their ethnic-specific Pasifika approaches, knowledge, and identity. In the resource flow space, we've collaborated with quite a few influential Pasifika networks to reorient and access resources that can lead to more effective activities to strengthen the local Pasifika prevention system. Sorry, an example of our work in the semi-explicit level in the relational change space is that when the first lockdown hit, there was a distinct lack of leadership around the comms for our Pasifika communities. And because of this, we're able to collaborate with Ranui 135 to mobilize organizations during that first lockdown to not only share data or up-to-date information of what's happening in a community, but also to identify and support each other's work. And I guess in that sense, also building a more cohesive Waitākere Pasifika support system. And this group has since continued to meet post-lockdown, and we've been very fortunate enough to elevate some of our conversations to our local MPs and council. And this work is part of supporting Pasifika organizations who work in a more collaborative way so that we're responding to the needs of our community, but also building sustainability so that we're not always just responding at the same time. Our work in the power dynamic space. Again, because of strong relationships, we're invited to several tables where we've been asked to provide community voice or community insight. And for us, this is about supporting Pasifika organizations to effectively navigate the mainstream governing systems, or I guess it's systems literacy. And it also allows organizations to better recognize opportunities for effective action in line with a more systems change approach. In the mental modes or transformative change level, in this level, our work is not necessarily about changing Pasifika mindsets, but reaffirming Pasifika that our values, which is like consensus and the stuff that I mentioned before, and fulfillment of mutual obligations, that's what's going to enable us to coherently and cohesively move our people from marching in the margin to leading sustainable change for our people. And all these different levels are interlinked. But I guess finally, the main thing, I guess, based on the work we have done, and these are some takeaways for you, but ultimately, our vision is to see Pasifika in control of their whole environment and contributing to all levels of society. And as a result, Pasifika are healthy, happy, connected, and prospering through our ethnic specific values and knowledge. That's me, team. Thank you very much, Malo Albito, and please, if you have any questions, let me know.
Oh, kia ora, Fole. Thank you for going through how you have ensured that the community voice is at the table, at that governance table, especially with decision makers. We have one question here. Have the processes and collaboration formed during the last lockdown made a difference in the response through this lockdown?
Thank you to whoever asked the question. It'd be good to know who you are, but yeah, it definitely has. I guess when we got the news last week that we were going into a lockdown, the group or the collectives itself quickly mobilized, and we're actually meeting this afternoon. First thing is to check in, to see how we're all doing, because it's almost, the group has also become a bit of a supervision session for each other. Check in to see how we're doing, but also to find out what we're all doing, and then see how we can support each other. So that's happening this afternoon. And I guess the good thing is too that we're just doing the doing on the ground, but leaders want to join in because they want to be part of it, and they want to know what's happening on the ground too. So we're just also very mindful that in this space that we allow those doing the doing on the ground to talk directly to the leaders, and that we just take a step back and make sure that their voice is heard in these forums. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Fole. We do have a question from the Skip team if they'd like to unmute themselves and ask as well. Kia ora, Skip team.
Kia ora, Fole, kia ora mō tēnā. My name's Mariah Tipa from the Skip team. Just the pātai, what is your strategy around priming people up into systems? Because especially in Māori communities and like Pacific communities, a big part of it is how do we prime whānau and communities up into system change, because that isn't our natural language, and how do we get to a space where if we prime our own people up and then they become the champions also in the bigger part of the mahi in the policy space.
Cool, thank you for the question. The big thing in terms of building readiness into our communities is being vulnerable. Vulnerable in the sense that if my function in a certain collective is to take the minutes, it's to take the minutes. If it's to chair, it's to chair. So it's about being vulnerable to the space that I'm most effective where I'm most needed. And that's my engagement with community and organizations. It's not, I'm here to help you, I'm here to do what you need. And that's what builds trust, that's what builds relationships, and that's what you can base movement on, because when you have that strong foundation of trust and relationship, you can then talk about, actually let's do something in this area. Let's engage with council to reorient funding from, for example, from building more bikeways to building more road, to building more boat ramps so we can get on wakas more, because that's something that connects with us more. So being able to build trust comes from those influencing and those leading being able to take a step back and say, I'll do what you need, which is, cut up the oranges or eat the oranges, wherever you're best needed. Hopefully that makes sense.
Fole, we have another question here from Jamie Walker from B Collective. Digital volunteering management. Just wondering if you think volunteering can help in any of those systems change areas. I mean, volunteering as pathways for Pasifika themselves, not outsiders coming in to help.
Well, volunteering in a Pasifika sense is, for me, it's very interesting because we do that anyway. it's just part and parcel of what we do. When we're part of a church group and we need to mobilize to do something, that's for us, that's just volunteering. That's just part of what we do. The difficulty sometimes is that when we're asked to do volunteer more time on top of what we do in amongst our normal lives. And it's not to say that it can't be done, but I think we need to recognize that volunteering or doing stuff over and above what we usually do is what we normally do anyway. And so we need to recognize first that all the extra things we do on top of our work, we do for our community, for our churches, that is volunteering, but we just don't really refer to it as that. That's just what we do, because that's how you work as a collective. You do the extra stuff on top of what, on top of what you're supposed to do. So I'm not quite sure if I answered your question there, but I think we need to recognize that bit first.
Beautiful, thank you, Fole. I'll just open up the floor if there's anyone else who would like to unmute themselves and ask a question. I'll just leave a few seconds for anyone to do so.
Hey Fole, kia ora, Nisambula and namaste everyone. My name is Zainul Sushi. I work with Fole actually. Hey, question for you. Over time, let's say over the last 30 years, what have been some really big system constraints that have hindered systems change for Pasifika? What are, from a helicopter view, what are the 3 big constraints for systems change in the Pasifika space for Pasifika people?
I think a big part, and firstly, before I get into that, I just want to acknowledge that the issues that I'm talking about now has been the same for 30 years. And we've had a lot of leaders in our community that have been talking about it and working towards it. But the biggest barrier I see, which is what I showed very early on, is that governing system. What I mentioned there was that it likes to work with like structures. So if your structure is not, or your system that you're working from is not like that system, or you're not visible like that system, it's very hard then to engage that system which provides all the resources. What I'm saying though is that for Pasifika, we need to go back to what we're good at, which is what makes us us and our values. Use those foundations, those values, to first of all navigate the system while we're trying to change the system at the same time. And the barriers have always been, we don't have people in certain places and in higher leadership roles. The reality is we have those people now. We have people in heads of DHBs, MPs and that, but how do we better mobilize community to support them? It's not about calling them out, it's about supporting them so that they can make those decisions, the hard decisions for our community. And the support for them is by way of mobilizing community to say, this is what's happening right now, this is what's needed. We support you to make the right call, even if it doesn't align with what your organization is saying. And in that sense, we're supporting right across the spectrum. We're supporting our leaders, and we're supporting our community at the same time. And then we're trying to bring them together.
Oh, that's beautiful, Fole, and really powerful. Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? We do have a few more minutes. Otherwise, we'll move on to Kerry. I'll just wait a few more.
I just make a comment, please.
Kia ora.
Okay, just comment on the response about priming. And I think it's important to note that it's about priming the governing system, not the Pasifika communities. That's all. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, it summarizes the whole lot.
Okay, well, kia ora Fole, thank you very much for joining us and presenting your mahi today. Really powerful and really inspirational, thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce my manager, Kerry Allan. She's all unmuted. Kerry, if you want to bring up your slides. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Caitlin. Thank you so much. Before I do that, like to introduce myself. Ko motupohi te maunga, ko makarewa te awa, no ingarangi no airana, ano hoki aku tipuna, I tipu ake a ho I waihopai, ko tamaki makauro taku kainga inaya nei, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Allan te whānau, ko Kerry Allan toku ingoa. Na mihi nui kia koutou katoa. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. Before I start my presentation, I would just like to acknowledge Foundation North. Foundation North supported us to bring this series to live. I'm not sure, but many of you may not have been part of our email list when we planned to run an actual face-to-face systems change event in March this year, which unfortunately got cancelled due to COVID. So this is a way that we've been able to bring some of our mahi to life and do it through a webinar series. So I just wanted to especially acknowledge Foundation North support for that. So this morning I'm going to be sharing with you, I'll just share my slides, work that we've been doing in, just grab this up, work that we've been doing around transforming built environments to enhance well-being. And not a very, very large topic, a very, very challenging area, as you can imagine, particularly in a city like Auckland. And also this type of work, just get my slides moving. Okay, sorry guys, I'm just pushing my arrow, but nothing's happening. There we go. So just acknowledging this type of work is obviously involves working alongside mostly our central and local government bodies. And for us in Tamaki Makaurau, that includes Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, Water Care, and then at a national level, agencies like NZTA. So bearing that in mind, the size and complexity of those agencies means that sometimes the workers are not at the pace we would like it to be, and that we have to be respectful and acknowledge the processes and systems that they actually have to work within. So just acknowledging that this work is, it's not a quick, we don't necessarily see quick wins, but we're in it for the long game. And I love how you said, Caitlin, earlier around this work is really about setting the scene, seeding change for, you know, our children's children, and creating environments that are going to be much more attractive, enhancing, health promoting, and enable people to actually make the most of where they live and work and play. So so the way that we do this work is obviously we engage with system stakeholders and community, most important, and bring community voice to the table. And some of the examples I'm going to talk about is that the way that we have done that in this type of work. Also, in examples where we've been able to work alongside and sit alongside Māori communities and Māori stakeholders to kind of really start to bring Māori local narratives, the whakapapa of some of our spaces and places in West Auckland, and what does it mean if we were to elevate and start to enhance and tell more of those stories of what it meant and what our, you know, what our whenua was like in past times. Fole's already presented the watermelon diagram, and this is another example of the conditions that hold a problem in place, the 6 conditions, which we use as a framework to help us identify our leverage points to try and, you know, influence or support change. So I won't go over that diagram. So in terms of the examples, I wish to, what's this doing this? There we go. So the first example I'd like to talk about is a piece of work that we've been doing really over probably 18 months at least. And it was around the opportunity to get alongside our local board and a council controlled organisation here in Auckland called Panuku. And it was to work alongside them to bring community, particularly Māori voices, into the design and the development of Opanuku Reserve. which is a local reserve not far from here in central Henderson. In terms of this piece of work, what some of our team did is they were able to broker engagement between Panuku and the local board with an existing Māori stakeholder rupu group that we had formed. And through that engagement, Panuku came and sat with that Māori rupu and asked them to provide their aspirational view and what they'd like to see happen, or how they'd like that reserve to be redeveloped, to actually identify and show what it would mean for Māori to engage and connect into that type of space. In that particular exercise, the Māori stakeholder group used Te Whare Tapawhā to identify and communicate back to the local board and Panuku around what they'd like to see. The second part of this particular piece was that the agencies identified that there was very little youth voice, particularly rangatahi Māori voice, that was being heard to help also design and construct this particular space, which does in fact include a play space. So we were able to work with 2 of our bilingual units with the students in the kaiako to actually take them physically down to the reserve and do a fairly rapid co-design process to bring those youth voices to the table and say, you know, what would you like to see here? What would bring you to this space? What would you want to do when you are here? Why would you bring your families and whānau down here to play or actively recreate or just connect and spend time together? So, sorry, I'm skipping now. So my second example is an emerging piece of work we're doing. It's about a piece of reserve called Miranda Reserve, which you can see from the map, hopefully, is kind of a long, narrow green space in one of our local border areas. It is, however, adjacent to quite a large green space called Olympic Park, which is a very popular, very well utilised space. And actually quite close to there is a bike hub and there's a lot of activity. However, what we've identified with Miranda Reserve is it's a very underutilised park. It's surrounded on one side by housing or kainga ora housing, and on the other side by sort of a new nice housing development, adjacent to a very low decile school and a community hub. And the community insights we've gathered so far are indicating that people do not use this reserve. They don't feel safe. The line of sight and visibility is poor. The upkeep of the awa, which I think you can see through running through the reserve, is poor. There's broken fences, and you know, the playground is not particularly attractive and damaged. So we saw an opportunity here to get alongside community, council, and in fact Waitākere, which in Auckland is our council controlled organisation who manages water supply, to start to actually go into quite a robust co-design process around what would community want to see, what would make it attractive, and what would draw community to this space. And it just so happens that Waitākere are doing a big project where they're putting I think it's called Central Interceptor, under the road and through the reserve, which means there's an opportunity for redesign of the space as well because of this piece of work that needs to happen. So this is exciting because, one, it's identified in the local board plan as a priority. Secondly, if you can see at the end of the reserve where the yellow road is, there is no connection or walkway or opening that allows people to move through this reserve and onto the road and over into Olympic Park. So there's a great opportunity here to increase safe spaces for people to move around, walk and cycle without being on major roads. And to the left of Olympic Park is a major town centre called New Lynn. So we really see the opportunity to open up a space for walking, cycling, scootering, playing, moving through, perhaps even restoration of plants, planting, etc. in the awa. So this is exciting emerging piece of work. around the Miranda Reserve. My third example is a slightly different tact, and our role's been quite different here, but we have a really significant project happening in West Auckland called the Fole Pathway. It is a ambitious development which will include, when it's completed, 15 kilometres of cycleway and walkways that will span from the Manukau to the Waitemata Harbour, and it will take in up to 33 reserve sports parks and roads. So a huge piece of work, really significant for West Auckland, and when it's finished, it will be in a major piece of infrastructure that will allow communities to again experience safe and attractive and inviting spaces to move through, to stop and play, to enjoy the awa, etc. So our role in this piece of work has been primarily around supporting the Fole Pathway Trust, which was set up, and the local board to, in the first instance, to mobilise community to help community understand the importance of this development. And as part of the process that happens through council, what we were able to do is we were able to help the Fole Pathway Trust mobilise community through community engagement events to understand that they needed to, if they wanted to have a voice around the resource consent process, they needed to understand what it meant, they needed to understand how to do that. And in fact, I can't quite quote you, but we've been told from council that they received 350 submissions for the resource consent, which is by far much larger than any normal process would happen, and 310 of those were positive. So that's enabled us to have a connection to a community that care about and live near this, this development. The other part to this piece is that one of our team has been asked to be on the board of Fole Pathway Trust, and that enables us to kind of keep bringing that kind of, you know, what else do we need to think about? What if major parts on the development and the route really acknowledge the whakapapa of the land and told Māori cultural narratives? What would play along the way look like? How do we get people to stop and enjoy, not just move through? You know, how do we look at the spaces and places so that it really is a place where people want to spend time? So this is a really exciting piece, and you may have heard, although if you're not a West Aucklander, you may not really care so much, but we certainly did, that the government has just announced a $35 million investment into supporting the completion of this. And that is huge for us. And I think this is a, you know, in years to come, people will look back and say, thank goodness this was done. This provides such a fantastic opportunity for people to move around. My last example is a piece of work that we have done in a local space, actually just near where we're located. And it started with I'll just refer to the map for a brief moment. So if you can see the road that's got the red outline, which is Lincoln Road, and the road that has the yellow highlighting, which is Rathgar Road, and to the left of Rathgar Road, that sort of small area there, we call that Lincoln North. And about 18 months ago, we undertook quite a robust co-design process alongside community and stakeholders to identify how we might support the residents and community members to be more physically active. We knew that a lot of the community that live there, it's quite transient. There's a lot of rental accommodation. There are a lot of schools. The Black Stars are schools located in this area. There are a lot of ECEs, but what we did identify through that process is there weren't a lot of spaces and places, apart from potentially schools, where people felt safe and wanted to be physically active. Most of the attractive spaces and places are in fact on the other side of Lincoln Road. And one of the key insights that we learnt from this piece of work was Lincoln Road was a barrier, definitely a barrier for people. And it is one of our major thoroughfares. It carries in excess of, I don't know, like thousands of cars a day, hugely congested. And most people with any sense try to avoid Lincoln Road at all costs. So what happened really, and then we went on to do some prototyping or testing of some ideas. And one of the ones that we tested was, what if we could get more students walking or biking or actually exiting the train station, which you can see down the bottom there, next to Swanson Road, excuse me. And at the very least, if that added 10 minutes to their day of walking rather than being dropped at school, then one, we're doing a little bit around moving, getting students moving a bit more, and we're also trying to help reduce the congestion of the cars moving up and down Rathgar Road. So we did a very quick, rapid prototype with Auckland Transport and the police, and we invited parents who would normally drop their students off to pull into the car park in that green space down the bottom that you can see, which is in fact a rugby club, and not in fact even enter or turn into Rathgar Road. It wasn't a very successful prototype. That's part of what we do in our work. We test things, sometimes they fail, but what we learned from that is that the parents we engage with and the parents and students we talked to outside the school said, it is simply just not inconvenient enough for me not to drive down Rathgar Road, even though it takes me 15 minutes and it's only 2 kilometres long. So that was really useful because, you know, that told us that actually until something becomes so inconvenient for people, they're not going to change their behaviours. So another tangent to this piece, which is the next thing I want to talk about, as we were doing this work, we were constantly sharing our insights in the voices of the community back to our local board. So they were kept up to speed about, you know, what we were doing, why we were doing it, and what we were learning, because that, you know, obviously they have an opportunity to make investment into some infrastructure changes. And so what occurred as a kind of unintended outcome with this piece of work is our Henderson Massey local board had identified they wanted to do a piece of work to improve what they called it the Henderson North Home and School Zone, to improve the movability and functionality of how our students and the schools moved around that local area, and how they could do something to change some of the infrastructure and the you know, functionality of the streets to try and support, in fact, exactly what we had suggested needed to happen. And so we were really delighted, because it wasn't solely because of our influence, but we were really delighted when they did decide to invest $1.1 million into a project, and that was fantastic. What we soon realised, our ultimate aim around this type of work is actually not just to take a small step to, you know, maybe changing the street by putting speed calming measures, but ultimately to have a healthy streets model where the aesthetics and the attractiveness and the tree planting and the other types of things that you can develop to create healthy streets. However, acknowledging that $1.1 million isn't going to go very far. So what in fact did happen is we now have 8, I think it is, speed bumps along Rathgar Road, which quite rightly Auckland Transport from evidence know that lowering the speed of cars is good for safety and does at least encourage more walking and cycling. So good first step. We would love to keep working on this to sort of start to challenge what else can be done now, how else might we get more students out of cars, how else might we start to change parent behaviours around the need for them to be driving them to the front of the school gates. And very much part of this work is working alongside the schools that, as you can see, are located along that piece of road. I do want to share one other piece of work that we've been doing, and this is, and I know that you probably can't, I don't expect you to read all this detail, but I just want to explain where this has come from. So as many of you would have experienced during level 4, people took ownership of their streets. They got out and about. You saw families riding. You saw people with chalk drawing on the pavement. We saw people sitting outside their houses, talking to their neighbours across the road who were sitting outside their houses. So there were so many interesting observations and positive things that we understood and observed during that time that we really wanted to capture. And we wanted to find a way to bring sort of thought leaders and community leaders together to say, well, out of all of that, how can we retain some of that was good? How can we find ways for communities to, you know, to be able to keep doing some of that sort of stuff, knowing in fact we're never going to take cars away. You know, we can't change that fact clearly. So we hosted what we called a thought leadership group, and it was really, the conversation was around active travel. So how can we help people prioritise and find ways to actually move around the communities without using motorised vehicles, and, you know, having more cars on the road and creating more congestion. And having less cars in Auckland is, there's so many reasons that we should be all working towards that. So out of that, we use as you might be able to see, the conditions of systems change to frame our conversations. And this is our first step to work with stakeholders and community around what are some of the things we might be able to do or test to actually support this type of work moving forward. So that's been a really interesting piece. And yeah, we're really excited about the opportunity around active travel, but what does that mean from an equity lens, and, you know, exploring that as we go forward. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm very happy to take any questions from you.
Kia ora, Kerry. Thank you for going over all the examples. I've been across a part of this work, so yeah, really beautifully said, and really, you know, a lot of significant changes in infrastructure is coming to West Auckland. So, you know, it's awesome that we can work with community to make sure that those changes that are happening will work for them by bringing them into the conversation at those early stages. There aren't any questions in the chat, so I'm really happy to open up the floor for anyone who would like to ask any questions, if you just want to unmute yourself. Oh, actually, sorry, we do actually have one. Oh no, we don't. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves, please ask a question now.
Kia ora, this is Tiffany from Auckland Transport. Thank you both for your presentations. Kerry, following on from what you were just speaking of, I manage the walking program for Auckland Transport, and I'm part of the Sustainable Mobility team. In that, one of the things that I'm really keen on is getting into the space of equity and making sure that when we are doing our, I mean, you've tackled the infrastructure, but the programmatic side of it, when we are doing events and activations, how do we actually get the community involved? And I'm at the point where I'm actually planning these things. So what I'd love to do is have a conversation about what that could look like, because I think it looks different. People have different natural inclinations of what they would like to do, what works for them. So I would love to hear more about how we can actually be in at the start, and Fole, that could be for you as well. Planning with the community the types of things they want to see in terms of getting more active in the community, how we as Auckland Transport can be a leader in that space. I'm specifically coming from the walking piece of it, but happy to hear any part of that.
Thank you, Tiffany. That's fantastic to meet you. We have got relationships with other Auckland Transport colleagues, obviously, but thank you. It's really great that you've jumped on board. And absolutely, you know, our philosophy is work with the willing, look at how we might support the likes of yourselves to, you know, engage and work alongside community. And certainly one of our key principles is equity, and, you know, being able to jump on a bike and bike to school isn't possible for everybody. Being able to walk around your neighborhood isn't possible for everyone because it's not safe. So, you know, we're constantly thinking of those things. And another piece of work, actually, just very quickly, we're doing is around play streets. And we are looking at how we might work with Auckland Transport around partially or fully closing streets. And we're currently looking at communities or neighbourhoods where we really want to test what it looks like for different sorts of communities to be able to do that. So that might be of interest too. But yes, we definitely would love to have conversations with you.
Thank you, Tiffany. And we do have a question here from Janie Walker. Can you share any of your community-led development models more generally for the work that we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure how you might like that to be shared. So, I mean, our normal way of operating is to use the CoDesign process, which is quite a disciplined process involving a series of stages, which, you know, is iterative. So sometimes you come back to the stage. That is quite a well-known, or so it's certainly easily enough to find, but we can share information with you after. And that involves, you know, a period, a sort of stage of, you know, understanding the issue, gathering your data, and the data is both at a macro and micro level. So it's data from, you know, the likes of research, but it's also the micro data is actually the lived experience of the community. So that is a really, really important part of what we do, is we go and talk to community and we understand the barriers and issues. And what, you know, so that's a phase. And then we go into an ideation phase where we work alongside stakeholders and community, say, well, what if, what is possible, what could be done, what could we test? And then we kind of go into this prototyping or testing phase. And, you know, a lot of things that we prototype or test, they don't end up being the solution, but they provide us with new learning, new kind of evidence, and certainly inform our next approach and our way forward. And then ultimately we come up with sort of community owned solutions to the problems that exist. And sometimes they're very small scale and sometimes they're in a very local area. But ultimately, through this kind of work, what we're able to do is we're able to share a little bit like the Henderson North example. We are constantly sharing up so into decision makers and people that hold the power and the influence. This is what community are telling us. This is what we're seeing. These are the opportunities that are presenting. So that's, I mean, there are other community-led development tools out there. I'm not an expert in all of them, but we can certainly share what we do and the tool we use.
Okay, Kerry. If there's anyone else who would like to ask a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask. We'll leave a few seconds for you to do that.
Oh, thank you, Caitlin. Ngā mihi nui koutou katoa te hui hui nei, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Malole lei, and warm Pacific greetings to some of my colleagues I see that's on here, and all our agencies and our wonderful community leaders. My name is Michael Alofa. I'm with the Community Empowerment Unit of Auckland Council. Our department delivers and look after all the work programs of the 21 local boards, and I'm the humble servant that looks after and delivers and carries the bags of the politicians out in the Waitākere Ranges and the Fole and the Henderson Massey. And I acknowledge Fole, Caitlin and Kerry. Thank you for the invite this morning. Look, my question, Kerry, thank you for those wonderful presentation, and I acknowledge all the wonderful leaders that are upon here on this Zoom and all the work and the mahi you do out in our communities. My question, Kerry, just touch on the Fole pathway projects that span across all the west from Manukau to Waitemata. Can I just ask who the lead agency is that's got a handle on that piece of work, please, Kerry?
Yes, good question. Lead agency, I'm assuming is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think my colleague Kathy might be on the, Kathy, are you on? Kathy, would
Yes,
you?
I am on, but I was slightly distracted. What was the question?
Oh, Kathy, yeah,
The TIFO pathway.
yeah, just that project that Kerry presented on. I just want to know who's actually leading that, please, running across so many local boards. I noticed.
It's coming out of Jill at Auckland Council in collaboration with the Trust, which is the Fole Coastal Walkway and Environmental Trust.
Okay, but does it start from out south across here, or is it just effectively sitting in the Fole?
It's effectively sitting in the Fole. Well, it goes across the Fole and Henderson. It does go across Henderson Massey a little bit, but all the local boards are connected into it. And yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that if you're interested.
Yeah, we'll take that offline. Thank you, Kath. Thank you, Kerry, Fole, and Caitlin.
Oh, kia ora, Michael, and nice to meet you. Okay, well, if there's no more questions.
Can I just make another comment, please?
Yes,
Yeah.
kia ora, Sita.
Talking about community, the question is which community, because it seems like it's a homogeneous community, whereas there is a different need for different, like ethnic specific data, who works, who runs. But I think it's important to note that when you talk about community, it's multi-ethnic, and different communities have different needs and wants and the way they exercise and so forth. Yeah, just a comment here.
Kia ora, Asita, you're 100% right there, absolutely. Okay, well, kia ora, big mihi, thank you to all of you who have taken the time to come and listen today. Thank you, Fole, thank you, Kerry. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, mō tō tautoko. Thank you to all of you who have participated. I'll close us with a karakia. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawha tō tātou ariki, a iu karaiti me te aroha i te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, amene.
Amen. Hey, Caitlin, can I just ask which one of you on the screen has got the winning ticket from the Lincoln Road store, please?
Who was it?
Come on, don't be shy. Put your hand up.
I wasn't going to say, but soon as you asked, Michael.
Okay, we'll take that offline.
Kia ora, everyone. Ngā manaakitanga. Stay safe.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ka kite.